HS358D students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. We are now into week 7, the week that your final drafts of your writing assignments are due. I will spend a little bit of time on that, not a lot, but I'll spend some time on that and talking to you about the basically the main themes for week 7 and what I might do to make up for the fact that the film that I was supposed to show in week 6 did not get shown because of Tuesday and the inauguration of the new president for Loyola and anything else I might need to make up for coming weeks. But first, let's talk about the process. I assumed it was pretty self-explanatory that if a quarter of the classes that I teach in African American history did not, in fact, submit their assignment, that would mean that some people obviously would not be, um, reading essays and giving feedback on them. But at least probably 10 of you in between the two African American history classes sent me emails wondering what they're supposed to do in the event that they don't have an essay, even though or that or asking me why don't they have one, even though if a quarter of class had submitted any, that means there are more students obviously than there are essays, which means that everyone was going to review one. So I just assumed that that would be clear. Apparently it wasn't clear. So I need to apparently lay it literally out step by step what happens if this doesn't happen and what happens if that doesn't happen, even though some relatively simple deductive reasoning should have laid that part out. There's that. Um, but beyond that, in terms of what I've seen from people's responses so far, in terms of what I've seen from reading stuff, I'm pretty pleased with the drafts that people did submit and the responses that people submitted in response. I will definitely score those. People's discussion grades for those who did not submit their assignments submit their first drafts either on time, and I mean really late, like Friday or thereafter, and particularly for people who did not submit at all, you will see a lower discussion grade. Um, that's just as simple as that. Your discussion grade will be lower. For some of you who came to class unprepared to discuss um, your first drafts of your introductions with thesis statements, same thing. You will see a lower discussion grade as a result. For those of you who could not score anything because you didn't have an essay to score, instead of just giving you points, you won't get points either way. You will not get scored on it, which means it doesn't hurt you or help you. You will not get a score on it at all. So your score will your overall score will be calculated differently. I'll figure out how to do that. But in the final analysis, you don't get an advantage because you didn't do it, and you don't get disadvantage because you didn't do it because you didn't have anything to do. So that's it. This should be pretty straightforward now at this point. For those of you who do in fact have um, assessments with feedback from reviewers, please use those in the process of revising your essay and making sure you do a spell check and a grammar check along the way and complete your essay in time for the end of the day on Sunday, October the 23rd by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If you are even 1 minute late and you do not have an extension, your score will go down 11 points. You will be marked down 11 full points for turning in your assignment late. I don't care if it's a minute late, a second late, whatever. It has to be in on time or you will get a lower score. For those of you who have extensions, the most I'm planning on giving out, unless there are some major extenuating circumstances, like obviously you've got COVID or or Ebola virus, or someone in your family died, among your friends or family died, or what other calamity that could happen, and that could happen to a few of you. Your extension will probably be no more than 3 days. I have too many students, too many courses to be waiting around a week, 10 days, etc. for folks to submit their material. If you do not submit your material on time, do not and have not gotten an extension in advance, and I mean by advance, I mean more than 24 hours. I'm not giving out any last minute extensions unless, of course, there are major extenuating circumstances. So short of that, if you are late and you decide I'm just going to bag it and then wait until after the end of, until end of the day, October 30th to submit it. If you do not submit within a week of the deadline, if you submit after that deadline, say you submit Monday, October the 31st, it's going to be trick time for trick-or-treaters that day for those who are late, because you will not get any score. You will get a zero. You will get a zero grade on your assignment. And with it being worth 45%, that's pretty substantial. So please get your stuff in on time. I'm making very few exceptions here. From what I've seen from this process, it is fairly obvious that there's a substantial proportion of the class who's not quite ready to take on the freedom of independence of taking charge of their own learning and being timely about getting stuff in on time. Some of you are still doing stuff at the last minute anyway, even though this whole process is designed to keep you from not doing things at the last minute. So, okay, fine. The stuff that's in the syllabus, I'm just reiterating here for you so that you understand. If you submit even a few minutes late, your grade, the highest grade you can get on your assignment is an 89. I don't care whatever else you did the previous weeks. 89 is the highest grade you can get. That's a perfect score, and most people don't write perfectly. If you submit a week more than 168 hours past the deadline, your score will be a 0. And I'm not changing it. There will be no extra credit. There will be no makeups. None of this. This is not high school. This is college, right? And I'm trying to give you as much college freedom as you can handle, but some of you seem to think that we're still in 9th grade. And I'm some 9th grade instructor, and I'm Mr. Collins and not Dr. Collins. This is college, and college requires you to get stuff done on time. I don't ask you to do a lot in terms of assignments, but I want you to do quality work when you do it. So there's that. Any questions, you can ask me in class on Tuesday. You can ask me during office hours, the virtual office hours on Wednesday between 2 and 3:30. That's where I have them. Only one of you has shown up for those so far. I have office hours from 12:30 to 1:30-ish on Thursdays. No one's yet to show up for that. My presumption is that because I wear a mask, and that you'd probably feel obligated to wear a mask too. Well, okay, good, because you would be. And that would be my preference. But if you don't want to do that, there's always the office hours on Wednesday too. So there's that. All right. So this week is predominantly about resistance and rebellion against slavery. Right, that's the week. That's the week aside of what free blacks were doing in the North and the South during the same period of time. Roughly the period we're talking about is 1791 to 1836 or so, because it really crosses 3 periods of U.S. history simultaneous to African American history: early national period, Jacksonian period, the beginning of the antebellum period in the South. So it's encompassing 3 things simultaneously. And I talked to you a little bit about the fact that the country is basically a plutocratic oligarchy of a representative democracy at its beginning, with only 6% of the population able to vote. That 6% being elite, rich, propertied white males over the age of 21. And a smattering of poor whites who've done some major service to their state or to the country as a whole because of the American Revolution. Generally speaking, that's who voted. And that doesn't change very much until the 1820s and 1830s. So that's the kind of society we're talking about slavery thriving in. And so there are a lot of moving parts here, but I want to concentrate primarily on resistance and rebellion both in the U.S. and across the African diaspora that is enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. So that's really it. And so the main thing here, more than anything else, if you want to take away anything else from this course, right, there are a lot of things I say are main things, but this is major, right? And it goes right along with the one about African Americans not having any culture, or African culture basically destroyed. The people's sense of understanding of that culture was destroyed when it became enslaved, and so on and so forth, which is complete lie. It's BS. This is also BS, and this also comes specifically from a school of thought that thrived at places like Columbia University and Duke University in the early part of the 20th century, particularly at Columbia, known as the Dunning School. The Dunning School is a school of thought developed by U.S. historians who consider themselves experts on race, racism, and African American history. Now, you can imagine that the people we're talking about here are basically middle-aged and elderly white guys, right? Some of them are Southerners. Some of them used to be slave owners. Some of them are the sons and daughters of slave owners. People like Ulrich B. Phillips, for example, who literally developed this school of thought at Columbia University and other Ivy Leagues and Duke and other places that basically said the following. One is that um, slavery saved those folks of African descent from the savagery and then the primitiveness of African thought and African civilization. That's one of the things and themes that comes out of that school. It's a big chunk. It's part of what, in fact, covered in class last week, and then the summary of the summary video for week 5. So there's that. But the other part of what comes out there's several pieces. There's a third piece, which I don't need to get into right now. But the second one is this. The idea that African folk who were enslaved did not resist slavery. They did not perform any activities of resistance. They didn't rebel. There was no daily resistance. They just were docile and they acquiesced, which is also complete BS, right? The truth of the matter is that there was always some resistance to slavery. There was always some rebelling against this. You know why? Because human beings are all human. Whether folks consider you inferior or superior or whatever, they're all human. And ranging human activities includes resistance to those things which oppresses them, which enslaves them. There's a certain degree of resistance. There's certain degrees of acquiescence. But there's very few humans who are 100% docile, 100% lack resistance, who are just, oh, well, I've got plenty of nothing and nothing's plenty for me. One of the theme songs from the play Porgy and Bess by Gershwin. By the Gershwin brothers and Gershwin and Stein. I can't remember what the other guy's name is, but anyway, it doesn't matter. That's these happy-go-lucky, I love my massa types, right? These, who we now call Uncle Toms, even though Uncle Tom is a fictional character from a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman who, thought herself to be an expert on things that she could not be an expert on from New England. So there's that. So the reality is it comes out of that kind of thinking, out of these folks trying to develop a mythology around the history of slavery and African Americans, which suggests that our ancestors, our collective ancestors as African Americans, including mine, or African enslaved blacks and slave Africans simply were just whatever. Far from the truth. We've already covered a week's worth of this just around culture alone. Development of the cakewalk as an offshoot of the ring shout. Is the praise house, right? All of those things, and the development of African American music and dance and religion and food culture and so on and so forth is by itself is a form of resistance. The idea that you would go ahead and develop things for you to use in order to enhance your own life in the midst of the brutality that is slavery is resistance unto itself. It's not so futile because you're doing this not only for yourself, but for the future of whatever progeny you either had to create because you were raped or wanted to create because you had some sense of hope and faith that this hell would come to an end at some point. So either way, that's a form of resistance. But there are other forms. Work slowdowns. Work slowdowns are a common form of resistance. And I talked about this already a couple weeks ago in class, but in the truth, it's a form of resistance. This idea that you rake, you hoe, you sow, you reap, you do whatever you're doing in the field to the beat of a drum or the beat of music that's keeping you going throughout the day. And the slower the beat, the slower your work speed. And so as a result of that, a lot of people were able to resist. That's a form of resistance. It's a very passive form of resistance was a form of resistance. You can't make people work so fast, no matter how, no matter what the circumstances are. So if they collectively slow down, unless you plan on whipping 300 or 400 people in one day or over a course of a week, not to mention the fact that if you keep doing that, morale drops, and you can't do that either. So it's better to work at their pace than um, to retaliate with more oppression. That's just one way to react. So that's one form. So work slowdowns, even work stoppages sometimes. Sabotage, broken tools. You could come in the field one day and find that all the all the all the ranks have been broken, the machetes have been broken, whatever it is that you're using as an implement to reap, sow, maintain weeds, get rid of weeds, whatever, is broken, right? And so that's a work stoppage, and someone does that, yeah, that's one form of work stoppage. Burn the field. If you burn 50 acres of cotton, right, that's 50 less acres you have to, yeah, you have to reap or take care of, right? So that's a way of doing things, right? There are a host of other things you could flood the fields, right? If you're close enough to a water source, you could flood the fields too. You can salt fields. You salt fields, that will stop stuff from growing. You might not be able to grow anything on that field for quite some time unless it's fertilized until you desalinize the soil. So there are a whole bunch of things people did, right? So sabotage is another form. There is literal, violent resistance. It could be from an individual. It could be from a gang of individuals. It could be a general rebellion. But there are ranges, and it can range from anything. One form of resistance simply would be, slave owner or overseer got on your nerves one day. You took him out back behind the barn somewhere, and maybe where you slaughter pigs and cows and kill his butt, right? That's a form of resistance, definitely a form of resistance to be sure. You are tired of being raped by your slave owner, but you happen to be a cook, and you go to, or the conjurer who can mix up a poison that's undetectable, put it in this guy's food, and make sure his ass is dead before he goes to bed. He's eating the best meal of his life, and he's also eating the last meal of his life because you're tired of being raped by him. That kind of thing, right? It could be a group of people who just decide, today's the day we're killing everybody. So that means just killing up, the slave owner, kill his wife, kill the kids, kill, his half kids, the kids that he's, who are, essentially what we would call biracial. They're dead too because they might have sympathy for him. Kill everybody in the house. Kill all the overseers. Right, which, by the way, once you get to that level, is more than just resistance. That's a full-scale insurrection or maybe even rebellion. But we'll get to that in a minute. Right, so killing, also another way without killing anyone other than yourself, is obviously suicide. You can kill yourself. You can commit suicide. You can poison yourself. Check out this way of life. You can, stab yourself with a machete. You can starve yourself to death and go on a hunger strike, which some people did. Sometimes they killed themselves by running away deliberately so that they can be torn to pieces by dogs and end up dying. That's another way to do it, right? So, and then another form of resistance is infanticide. A lot of women didn't want their kids to grow up in this kind of life. So what they ended up doing was killing their kids, right? If they couldn't figure out a way to induce an abortion through the conjurer, or through some healer or health or some person who knew the right herbs, certainly infanticide was there. It was a possibility as well. You could claim anything: disease, sickness, and disease. Worms, snakes, whatever, right? So those are all forms of resistance. Escaping with your own body, stealing your own body was a humongous form of resistance, became a bigger form of resistance over the course of the 19th century in particular. Something like 100,000 African Americans, enslaved folks managed to escape, make their way to cities, make their way up north, make their way to Canada, make their way maybe even cross, to the Caribbean or somewhere, made their way to Indian country in northern Florida in order to escape slavery. So some of them who didn't escape might have used it as a form of suicide as well. So those are all the most common forms of resistance. But a form that is a huger form of resistance beyond just the individual plantation or individual slave owner or individual group of overseers is, in fact, rebellion. Either conspiring to rebel or actual full armed rebellion against slavery, where it's not just one plantation or couple. You're doing it against across the countryside, against an entire community of plantations, entire community of enslavement. So across the state of Virginia, for instance, or South Carolina and other places where there was resistance. And there's this idea that there weren't really that many forms of resistance, right? Therefore, we are not our ancestors. I am not my ancestor. You can't make me. You can't expect me to, acquiesce to oppression the way they did. Well, they didn't acquiesce either. That's the truth. They did not acquiesce at all, not even one iota. In the colonial period slash the period of the national period of the U.S. in the period really between 1712 and about 1831, there were at least four main rebellions between New York, um, the Carolinas, and of course Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia. Denmark, Vesey's attempted rebellion in 1822. There are at least four, but historians have found a total of 30 during the colonial period and the early national period U.S. in which there were rebellions, right, where groups of enslaved blacks, sometimes with free blacks, with the help of free blacks and with the help of whites even, uh, would engage in armed rebellion and killing people, killing slave owners, killing folks who condoned slavery, killing overseers, trying to overthrow the system. All these rebellions were failures, right? Otherwise, they would be called full-fledged revolutions. All of those rebellions were failures, right? Nat Turner's was the most famous of them, but they're not the only ones. And the result is some of the stuff that I talked about last week in class regarding the Bill of Rights, about the First Amendment right to freedom of assembly, was taken away not only from enslaved Africans, but from free blacks as well. New York passed a law specifically that required colored people, required Negroes, to not gather in groups larger than three. That if you gather in group three or larger, that you are subject to arrest and imprisonment because you're thought to be conspiring. You know, the Carolinas temporarily ended importation of slaves for 10 years because of an armed rebellion led by recently enslaved Africans, along with free blacks and enslaved black folk who were born into slavery. It was a combined armed struggle. There are examples of this. Same thing happened with Vesey's planned rebellion in 1822. Same thing eventually happened, Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. So just using those examples alone, these aren't the only examples. There are 26 other ones out there, but I can't cover them all. So the bottom line is there's a lot of resistance to slavery. But the main form of resistance to slavery, at least as far as the handful of whites that became part of a larger movement, was the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement in the 18th century is very small, but it's very vocal too. The Quakers, the Quakers in the colonial period of the U.S. Formally denounced slavery in 1711, not 1811. 1711. They denounced it in the Caribbean in 1687, but they had renounced it in what we now call the U.S. in 1711. So that's a full 120 years before the rise of William Garrison and the Liberator newspaper proclaiming that slavery needed to end. And there are a host of other folks, Quakers, some Methodists, some Baptists, some folks living up north, some folks living south who are in opposition to slavery. But here's the thing. Most of these folks, with the exception of Quakers and some Shakers, most of these folks were also anti-black in the cruelest possible way. Because what was their solution to the problem of if we do end up with abolition? Well, repatriate these people back to Africa, send them back to Africa. Immigrationism was their main philosophy. That's what they believed in. They didn't believe that this could be a multiracial society in which whites and blacks can live together in harmony. As we kind of realize in 2022, that's a fantasy, living together in harmony part. Maybe we're multiracial, but we're not living together in harmony by any stretch. So, but that's what we're talking about here in terms of resistance and rebellion. What changes things in order to make slavery even harder than it already is in the early U.S. is that there are armed rebellions not just going on in the U.S., but in other slave societies throughout the Western Hemisphere. There's the Haitian Revolution, which is not just a rebellion because it actually overthrows the entire social order in Santo Domingo. Not only for Haiti, but to some extent for what was now the Dominican Republic as well. There's also numerous rebellions in Brazil, numerous rebellions in Cuba, numerous rebellions in Puerto Rico and other parts of slaves in Jamaica and other parts of slave societies throughout the Western Hemisphere. And that makes U.S. slaveholders in the U.S. particularly frightened, especially once the Haitian Revolution fully takes hold in 1804, in 1805, and 1806. We'll talk more about that in class. We'll talk more about these other things in class, and your lecture notes cover these more extensively than I can today. But the bottom line is that lots happening to indicate that enslaved Africans and enslaved black folk weren't the simple docile people that the Dunning School and quite frankly many other whites, quite a few African Americans thought that they were. So.